All right, great. I think we can go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone so much for joining us today. Welcome to On the Park Bench, a public square conversation brought to you by Congress for the New Urbanism. On the Park Bench presents conversations with thought leaders in new urbanism and allied industries, providing an opportunity for the audience to engage in real time. The webinar series is a platform for CNU members and allies to engage, debate, and collaborate on the pressing issues of the day. So if you have any thoughts, you can share your thoughts on #OnTheParkBench to www.tinyurl.com/OTPB-feedback. And we hope you will join us for CNU 31 in Charlotte. This is our 31st annual Congress that we are bringing to one of the most diverse, vibrant cities in the American Southeast with deep roots in new urbanism. In Charlotte, we are introducing the annual Congress Focus, a big idea that influences all the content at the Congress, and the focus of CNU 31 is corridors. Registration is open through April 20th. So you can register now at cnu.org/CNU31. And do not forget about CNU memberships. You can save up to $250 throughout the registration windows by being or becoming a CNU member at the discount or urbanist level. You can learn more about membership at members.cnu.org. And now for today's webinar, I'd like to welcome Dan Parolek. Dan is an urban designer and architect, author, and the founding principal of Opticos Design, a B Corporation focused on equitable urban placemaking, innovative housing design and policy, and zoning reform for walkable urbanism. Dan and his work have been featured in many high-profile publications, including the New York Times, San Francisco Chronicle, Next City, Fast Company, and Curved. Dan has championed the missing middle housing movement, launched missingmiddlehousing.com, and wrote the book Missing Middle Housing, Thinking Big and Building Small to Respond to Today's Housing Crisis, which is now available from Island Press. And we'd also like to welcome Eric Kronberg. Eric Kronberg is a zoning whisperer. He specializes in examining and demystifying zoning ordinances to help find ways to make great projects possible and help others navigate through the zoning swamp. He uses his skills for the force of good as a principal at Kronberg Urbanists and Architects, leading the firm's pre-development efforts by combining skills in planning, development, architecture, and zoning. Eric leverages this potent cocktail to chart the course of best possibilities for each site's redevelopment. His work with KUA, the Incremental Development Alliance, the Congress for the New Urbanism, the Georgia Conservancy, and the National Town Builders Association has solidified his stance as an advocate for walkable and bikeable communities. And I'm Lauren Mayer, the Communications Manager at CNU. I am now going to hand the webinar over to Eric and Dan for presentations about Culdesac Tempe and Culdesac Atlanta. Will be followed by a moderated discussion with the panelists. We will then open up to questions from the audience. So please use the Q&A function of Zoom to ask your questions as they occur to you. All right, take it away, Dan.
Great, thank you, Lauren, and hello to everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. It's always a pleasure to be here on the park bench to have a active and engaged conversation. And this is a topic that obviously it's super fun and one of my favorites to talk about, delivering car-free urbanism. In particular, focusing on the Culdesac Tempe project that we worked on with the Culdesac team. And, as I'm sure many of the people online are designers or planners, landscape architects, it's a real joy when you get a call from a client that sort of asks you to take on a project like this. I think all of us over the course of my 25 plus year career have always been thinking about sort of car light, walkable urbanism, but like be able to actually have the opportunity to really design a project that's not hindered by the integration of the car is just a really amazing opportunity. And just, kudos to Ryan Johnson and Jeff Behrens, the founders of Culdesac, to have this vision to not just create a car-free neighborhood like we did in this and Eric's doing in Atlanta, but they have this much bigger vision of actually delivering a car-free city ultimately, which is really exciting to think about. And I'm actually going to start with a video, and I think this should work, but because this project actually is becoming a reality. This is a video from about a month ago, so I thought this would be good to just show this so that people get a good sense of the overview of where the project's currently at. And it starts with this view over the Smith Martin Light Rail Station at the mixed use center of the project. And I think I turned off the music because it's the typical sort of typical music from a YouTube video, but I'm just going to talk about it a little bit as it goes through the video, and then I'll show some additional slides. But the 3 mixed use buildings from the original plan are mostly completed. One of them will be occupied sometime in the next month as the first residents start to move into the project. You can see the project, that slideshow, the project is about 2 miles from downtown Tempe, which is also where ASU's main campus is. And you can see here the restaurant in this image is actually Cochina Chihuas, is actually now it's actually open. I actually had a wonderful dinner there last week at a ULI conference in Phoenix and met the chef. This building will have a 8,000 square foot market in the ground floor. It's going to occupy that space sometime in the next couple of months. And you'll notice that, and I'll talk a little bit about this, but the architecture is purposefully restrained. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in my slides, but this is the main plaza space with the beautiful shade pavilion done by a local artist. These are the live work units. And then this is just image going into the inner block courtyard spaces, which are really starting to feel fantastic. And the trees were starting to be put in last week or 2 weeks ago when I was out there. So it was really starting to feel like the images and the intent, design intent that our design team had. And local artists are a really key part of sort of the programming and the overall reinforcing the sort of creative environment and sense of community in this project. So you can see like I'll give you some of the numbers, but the first couple of phases are almost completed. And as I mentioned earlier, the first tenants are going to move in. I think just in terms of I have this broken down in a series of about 4 sections. And the first one is just the idea, and I won't take credit for the idea. This is Culdesac, Jeff and Ryan's big idea, but and these are a couple of slides from them. But I just think, creating a built environment designed from the ground up for shared mobility. I think car-free is what we often sort of frame this conversation as, but it's sort of mobility rich is just another great way to be thinking about this and communicating it. And one of the really amazing things that the Culdesac team has done to really deliver this mobility rich living experience for the residents is they've established partnerships with these local mobility companies and agencies to deliver up to, I think it's up to delivers about up to $3,000 in annual value or discounts for their residents, and discounted Lyft memberships, discounted transit passes, discounted car share, and bike and scooter share. So it's really amazing that they're thinking this way about not just providing car free, but actually delivering those mobility choices to the residents. I think just a couple of images on the inspiration. I think it's pretty self-explanatory in terms of what the place is starting to feel like and what the architecture is feeling like. But obviously we had inspirations from an architecture and typology standpoint that range from the really beautiful vernacular buildings in like the Barrio Viejo in Tucson to, Greek villages, Southern French villages, Egyptian villages. But also there's some really beautiful a history of really beautiful desert modern architecture and typology in this region that we also wanted to study and learn from and reflect. And I just wanted to show this because I discovered this architect, Egyptian architect Hassan Fathi, our team did, and just really beautiful sort of desert responsive buildings that we studied as we explored this project. And then from an urbanism standpoint, I think, just the really narrow, informal, organic, pedestrian ways that exist in all historic communities around the world, really thoughtful public spaces that respond to the desert climate. And then just the team also gravitated toward just really looking at this trend of really beautiful painted signage and public art to really reinforce a strong sense of place and a brand for the project. In terms of the desert responsive urbanism is obviously in a place like Phoenix with such an extreme climate, it makes complete sense, especially when you're removing the cars from the equation, that the urbanism respond to that extreme desert climate. And the project is the site's about 16 acres, just a little over 600 units. So 40 dwelling units per acre. It would have been really easy for Culdesac say, hey, we want to double that and go up to 5 to 7 stories. But their vision for this particular project, this started 4 years ago as well, was a 2 to 3 story walk up neighborhood, and we were easily able to achieve that 40 dwelling units per acre in a combination of 2 to 3 stories. But there's 0 residential parking spaces, but there are parking spaces for the commercial and the food and beverage tenants in the project. And you can see there is one of the organizing elements of this plan is this primary paseo that goes to the east and the west, and that was partly driven by location of existing utilities from previous structures on the site, but it was also driven in terms of the width of it by fire access and emergency access to the project area. So, and I'll show you a diagram of the emergency access plan, but I think we delivered about a 60-page document to the fire chief to walk him through how each one of these buildings would be accessed in case of a fire. But you can see the really organic block typologies, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. The narrow paseos deliver what we call a series of theatrical events as you're walking or biking or scooting your way through the project from one end to the other. And this is the primary east-west paseo. We called it the spine. In the design rounds, it sort of terminates at the station in the Cucina Chihuas restaurant. And this is a view of the main plaza space. Obviously, just being really thoughtful in terms of the size of it, wants to be big enough to sort of be an iconic space for the community, a place where people can gather, but also not so big that when it's 100 degrees out, that there's not shaded places to sit and to congregate and meet up with friends and neighbors. And this is just that, and similar image to what you saw sooner of that main plaza space starting to take shape with this beautiful shade element from a local artist. And these are just some images of the typical, this is a pretty typical primary public paseo. That's about between 8 and 10 feet from building face to building face, activated by frequent entries into the units. And every single unit has direct access to a paseo, but also to the inner block courtyard spaces. And this is the passage that goes from the main plaza space into the community and leads to the network of those paseos. Fire access diagram, you can see a series of, we wanted to keep the paseos as narrow as possible. And so we're really thoughtful about sort of creating sort of truncated access ways, routes for the emergent fire and emergency access vehicles, so that we could, not just blow out and create really wide paseos. So we really spent a lot of time thinking about this access and making sure, working with the fire chief and his team to to make sure that they were comfortable with the routes that we were providing for that access. And this is just a view from the transit station down the main spine. The first two, just a quick summary of the first two phases that have been built. It's about 175 units in those first two phases, and mostly completed at this point. Housing and block types, once again, desert responsive in their approach, but we created a system of unique but repeatable building types. They're all walk-up. None of them have internal corridors, and they're all one room deep to maximize natural light and passive cooling. And the buildings were intended to be organized around interblock courtyard spaces. This seems to be most people's favorite image of the project to date. Hopefully it'll be replaced by a photograph within the next year with some landscaping and people in it. And then those types are organized to create these blocks that have a network and a hierarchy of courtyard spaces, and every block has a primary courtyard that's bigger than the rest of them, and then a series of secondary and tertiary courtyards that are connected by narrow passageways. And these are just some of the images of a couple of those blocks in progress. And one of those primary courtyards right here that's starting to get the landscaping. You can see the seating area to the right, and then some of the narrow passages that connect between those passageways. And in terms of the architecture, I mentioned this earlier, but I just wanted to mention we really challenged ourselves to deliver a really thoughtfully restrained architecture. It's fairly similar to what the precedents that you saw in that imagery, whether it's in the barrio in Tucson or a Greek or Egyptian village. And it's really important that it just lets the buildings play their role as fabric buildings and to define and activate the public spaces. And in terms of the last section, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the community. This is a piece that people don't really know that much about typically, is there were a number of really great tenants, including the Street Corner Urban Market, Cochina Chihuas, and the Fire Creek Coffee Company that have leases, a great curating called the Culdesac team's part to get these tenants in and to provide these amenities. And just a part of that, delivering that walkability and that sense of place. But the Culdesac team has also been really amazing at incubating and planting the seeds of community through pop-up events on site and through their social media as well. And this was an early pop-up event on the site. And more recently, they've been doing what they call Little Chola events every Thursday night that have local artists that sell their crafts on the main plaza space. So it's a really great way to start creating that sense of place and creating it as a destination and supporting the local artist community. And really amazing public art taking shape in the project as well, which is I think just really gives it that added layer of placemaking and really roots it in its region. And as someone who's a real sort of fan of street art, I'm super thrilled to see, like, over the course of years of studying street art in London and Barcelona and Rome and Paris, of just like how street art can really help define the creative nature of a community. And in terms of just some last slides, we can talk about these later, but people get a little bit, the project on the left is actually the project that was entitled on the site. It wasn't actually feasible, so it sat entitled for a number of years before the Culdesac team acquired the property. But you can see these are actually the same scale, and the previous project had about just a little under 700 units and about 1,400 parking spaces, and our 2 and 3 story version has 640 units and 200 spaces for just the retail and tenant. So you can see how the integration of the parking really inflates the necessary scale of the buildings to get to a very similar program. And this is just the vision that's really coming to reality now, that it's really amazing to see this. I was last there a couple of weeks ago and took a bunch of these slides. And I do just want to say that I'm the one sort of participating in this, but I have a very talented team at Opticos, and I just want to give them sort of a pat on the back for collaborating with the Culdesac team to deliver this amazing project. And the Culdesac Tempe project is one of the case studies in my Missing Middle Housing book. So I just, if you scan the barcode, the QR code here, it'll take you directly to that book. But I'm also fairly active on LinkedIn. So if you want to I occasionally will post on Culdesac or some of our other missing middle projects for public or private. But with that, I'll hand it off to Eric to talk about his Culdesac work in Atlanta. Eric, you're on mute.
That's even better. Now you can hear. Thank you, Dan. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Dan, for that great walkthrough of Culdesac Tempe. And Culdesac Atlanta is definitely at a much earlier stage of development, to say the least. We've helped with some of the entitlements and site chasing and some initial design. Urban Oasis is a great local partner helping Culdesac in pursuit of some things here as well. Let me see if I can make sure my mouse is, there we go. There. And so for a little bit of context of what's going on in Atlanta, the gray is our city limits. The cyan tealish color is the proposed location of the Atlanta Beltline. That is our great 22-mile mobility focused corridor that is really focusing development. This northeast quadrant is mostly built out. The southwest quadrant is partially built out. We've got two projects we're helping Culdesac with in the southwest quadrant. And from an economic and racial standpoint, northeast, rich white, southeast, southwest, and northwest, basically poor and African American. The other thing that's really helpful to understand from a context standpoint is there's not a lot of opportunity to connect the existing MARTA lines, which are these black dots, MARTA stations, to the Beltline. And so we're going to be talking about some really powerful stuff in Southwest that is going on with Culdesac and these larger mobility plays. Zooming into the Southeast area, there's the stuff that you may have seen in the news. There's a state farmers market, which was an public RFP. Quasi-governmental agency owns it, trying to sell it allegedly. There's still tons of ongoing negotiations. So there's only a little bit of this I can talk about, which is kind of the cool big meaty project everybody's interested in following. But the other project we've helped with that's moving along a bit faster, we call 1314 Murphy. This is a really critical anchor for the city of Atlanta in that there's a spur, the Beltline, ABI, the quasi-government agency owns most of this land. They don't own this little yellow piece, which is in the land that Culdesac purchased. So part of this is looking at key connectivity of the Beltline. Down here, this is the Oakland City MARTA station. So this is how Atlanta's Beltline will connect to transit in Southwest. There's a few other options in the Northeast Central, but this is critical for the Southwest part of town. So when we talk about micromobility, we're also looking at, Beltline and larger forms of mobility in Atlanta. This is a really big part of that. There we go. Come on. There we go. And so when we talk about the state farmers market, this is the initial look. There will have to be some adaptive reuse. This has to go through a community input process. There's definitely a goal to utilize some of the courtyard product. That was been refined and started in Tempe. There's definitely going to be some 4- and 5-story mixed-use buildings. There will be some townhome. There will most likely be a parking deck in this development based on a range of trade-offs to provide adequate parking to the office, incubator, retail spaces that are involved. And for site size, this is about 20 acres over here, and a lot of the final uses and mixes are in flux. We haven't really been able to begin community engagement because we're still not there yet with the Beltline in terms of negotiations on the site. So it's been a long, hard road to get here with the Beltline. This is their second time taking this site to market. We were on a team for the first time, went to market many years ago. That was our team did not get selected. It was a political disaster for ABI. So we're hoping they can get this on Culdesac so they can move that forward in a positive fashion. There we go. Come on. Next page. There we go. And then again, some more renderings of activation on the ground. There is a very significant and appropriate emphasis on small business incubation, definitely for minority business owners. So we're looking at high-level strategies of smaller spaces. How do you support and activate? You know, this gets into tenant improvement strategies and rent subsidy strategies. But a lot of this in terms of making a place appropriate to Southwest Atlanta is about inclusion, it's about equity, it's about how do we integrate these things to make it viable for everybody. Let's go there. And then briefly, to show how this stuff starts to connect. This is the Beltline is up over here. This orange is owned by the Beltline. This darker gray is the land that Culdesac would contribute to help make this connection happen. We're working diligently with the city of Atlanta, the Beltline, and other groups to look for fast track funding to get this trail laid in as soon as possible. Coincidentally, they bought a site across the street. So we've got this 5-acre site here and then the site across the street. And just to give you a sense, you know, Dan's metrics are great. Where Culdesac started at 40 units per acre. In Tempe, land prices, construction costs, and other pressures have got us at 120 units an acre here. So we're triple the density to make this project work. And so in terms of a quick site diagram breaking into phases, there will be some 5/2 due to basement and grading considerations for topography here in this primary building. Some tightening and focusing on the courtyard product still here to keep this as a core component of Culdesac, but this is another 5/1 building in order to make this project feasible. This is all the public Beltline spine, working through a couple different phases of how this gets activated, maintaining space for future transit, and then near-term and long-term pedestrian connectivity as well. Come on, mouse. There you go. Some quick diagramming, looking at a lot of the bike and pedestrian connectivity. There will be connection to the train station, but we do see a lot of the coming and going coming from the bike paths here through the Beltline spur. And then also, you know, as Dan's had those really great fire lane diagrams, ours were a bit simpler in terms of how this works. You know, seeing the center as a paseo and being really thoughtful about how we do that with limited, you know, short-term parking for business, but, you know, most of the parking back here only for retail, out of the way of the back alley, and really kind of focusing in the core of this is pedestrian experience. A little bit of quick diagram of retail and activation. The other thing that's a core public space component is we have a bit of bizarre right-of-way due to realignments of roads for crossing into the train tracks years ago. So we have a large public plaza that's been a large centerpiece of community conversation about, you know, how does this get activated? How do we make this amazing? And how do we do that in the public right-of-way? So working with the city agencies to make that go as well. Again, we do have some parking, you know, in pink for the commercial, looking at being thoughtful, trying to minimize how the cars come in and are relegated to limited components of the site from a flow standpoint. Lots of bike parking distributed. One of the other things that are, you know, key, I think, in both projects is there's a tremendous amount of interior, safe, secure bike parking, tremendous focus on e-bike charging as well for the interior connection. But this is just a diagram of really could call it guest parking, you know. So I think we ended up with, 144 guest parking spaces for bikes, and we were targeting around 1 bike space per unit for interior parking in addition to that. Again, a couple quick, you know, inspiration images. You can kind of typical Verdure for that center space, you know, looking at good paving, good street engagement, you know, for where that is headed there. Come on, mouse. And then some early renderings of the plaza activation. Again, you know, Culdesac's done a great job in Tempe of that tactical activation to get people engaged. And the goal is for this plaza to be that long-term site for activation as part of this project's development. Also knowing that this is going to work as a bit of an archipelago and a connection to the larger Murphy Crossing site, which is the State Farmers Market, the main 20-acre site. Come on. Some early concept renderings, you know, just really looking at making sure there's good massing, there's good engagement for the retail to invite the plaza, looking at connection for the multifamily. again, keeping it simple, keeping it staged, trying to focus on better materials, but helping them get an initial concept to work through initial approvals to get into site permitting. And one of the things, again, some tighter passageways, trying to be cognizant of scale of how these buildings are going to integrate as an early stage design component. This is some 3-story courtyard product, but we'll show you in the next slide that in order to get some of these densities, the 3-story product for courtyard not only have to be tightened, but we ended up with some partial 4-story components here, one to get the unit yield, but also to make sure we get adequate light and air coming into these courtyards. But this is 2 stories of flats, and then up to the 3rd floor, you've got 2-story units above to get a little bit extra density. So, a lot of trade-offs and balancing of when you're asked to go from 40 units an acre to 120, how, what do you do to make that fit in and stay as true to the brand as possible? And also up in Culdesac, realize that with construction and land prices, some of the amazing stuff Dan got to do at Tempe with these lower density things may just not be feasible moving forward in future projects. And with that, I will stop share. And happy to turn it over to Lauren for Q&A.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentations. It's already see things visualized, and especially these 2 projects being at different stages, kind of what's to come, especially. And speaking of these being 2 different projects, this is basically a template that is being implemented in 2 different car-centric cities. How do these projects differ in design, and how do the different land bases and yields impact the projects as a result?
So I might start with land. Obviously, some of my presentation touched on, a lot more density. We've had a lot of conversations with Culdesac that I think still need to be fleshed out in terms of, let's call it placemaking within these larger format buildings, not just on the ground, but in the interior spaces. So there's an even greater role for the architecture to work through some of those things. So that exists. But I do think also, Tempe, it's hot, but it's flat. They've got some great connectivity and the light rail coming in. Atlanta, I think, also gets a misnomer as being very car-centric, and a lot of the city is, but most of the core city, built before in the 1920s or up to the 1920s, has some amazing walkability. And what it tends to suffer from is connectivity between these different neighborhoods is not as great as we'd like. But e-bikes are an amazing equalizer, right? And that's been really transformative in Atlanta without Culdesac to see how much e-bikes are really giving people mobility options and how massively the Beltline's getting utilized. So, Culdesac's comments were that they were plugging into a rapidly evolving system in Atlanta, as opposed to trying to convince a car-centric city to do something else. And Dan, you're on mute this time.
I think that the climate response is like one major difference. Like we wouldn't plant a project that looks like Culdesac Tempe in too many other places in the United States, whether it's Atlanta or anywhere else, because the urbanism and the architecture is very responsive to that, and the precedents we studied were responsive to that. I think what's super interesting is to see as their idea evolves and land values increase and construction costs increase, of how they can sort of hold on to their core concept and values and mission, but how can creative designers like Eric and his team like sort of take the design to the next level of like, how can you do 4 stories instead of 2 and 3, but still achieve what they're trying to achieve with the courtyard spaces and the public realm. So, but I think that's pretty common, and even in non-car free projects is you're in terms of the placemaking. But it's I saw a bunch of questions in the Q&A about sort of how did you convince people that this was viable? And I think what's really interesting is when the project Culdesac Tempe first went public I think it was the Wall Street Journal in November of, what was it, 2020? I remember all these comments of like, oh, nobody's ever going to live car free in Tempe. this project's going to fail miserably. And I just did some really quick math of like what the entire Phoenix metro sort of rental market was. And I think they need to capture like 0.0002% of the entire market to be successful. And like, I think one thing that new urbanism has proven from the very beginning is that there's a market for different living choices that are more urban, more walkable. And I think this is just like taking that to the next level of like, yes, there are people that want to live car free. Does 90% of the US population want to live car free? Probably not, but does 5, 6, 7, or 10, 20%? Maybe if you give them a choice. That choice that's outside of the major metropolitan centers at a neighborhood scale. So
I would add, one of the things I saw with Tempe is you've got, like you said, Dan, ASU is what, 70,000 students. It's one of the largest public universities in the nation, and it's only a couple of metro stops away. So as a complete fallback, you got kids in college maybe not having cars a few stops away to live in a pretty amazing spot. Like, not that you want this to be student housing, but like I'm sure the developer investor side were like, that's a really easy, safe target market if you don't capture other folks.
And the other interesting thing that's happened is I think over half of the first phase residents are moving from out of state into this project. So it's become a real destination. And so what market exists is almost not even, it doesn't matter. Like the market is coming, and it's sort of people. And the other interesting thing is, I think that we had a lot of discussions about like what type of households will live in this type of community. And, this has happened in most of our missing middle scale projects as the baby boomers show up in far bigger numbers than anybody expects. And the single person households, and actually families have started to show up in ways that I don't think any of us necessarily expected, but I think it's fantastic.
Wonderful. Yeah, really interesting to kind of hear about all the different groups that are interested in these and how they might not necessarily be the stereotypical ones that you would think of for these kinds of projects. And that also dovetails nicely with the next question I wanted to pick your brains on, which is what kinds of public and private partnerships do these projects work with? And like, what is the role of political will in getting these projects started and gaining momentum?
Ooh, I mean, I think, Culdesac had some, I'll let Dan talk to Tempe, but in Atlanta, one of the critical things is Tim Keene, our former planning commissioner, helped get a range of zoning reforms, quick fixes passed from like 2017 to 2019. One of which was that there was no parking required for any uses within a half mile of transit. And so that just takes the parking conversation off the table. Right, you don't have to provide it. You can just focus on what you want to, provide. In working with the communities to get approval for the 1314 project, we're right next to the train and the railroad and the MARTA line, and so there's limited crossings. There's a lot of neighbor concern about traffic and backing up, all the typical things you expect to hear from a community. And they knew about Culdesac, and we didn't even actually tell them it was Culdesac going through the community process for the first project. That was kept completely under wraps, and the community was just really appreciative that we were doing a low park project that would add amenity, that wouldn't contribute to traffic, that would help get rooftops for other retail to come. So that in itself was really helpful. We've really been Culdesac, we've been pushing on the city for offsite improvements. That spur trail I showed is huge, right? There's definitely other infrastructure that's necessary that just the private development side can't pay for all that. So having the city come in with this infrastructure is a huge deal, and that's a pretty reasonable ask, I think, for the city. Also, when all the constituents are in alignment asking for it too, right? It's not the developer versus the neighborhood. We're all on the same team. How do we get some investment in Southwest Atlanta?
Sorry, Lauren, I was multitasking not so successfully. Was a question about entitlement?
We can add that to it for sure. It was mainly just about the role of political will.
Okay, I mean, it's really important. I mean, in Tempe, very early on, a number of city council members and the mayor became big champions of the project. And I would say in most of our projects, that's the case. And, you know, even just from an economic development perspective, who doesn't want to be the city on the cover of the Wall Street Journal? Like it's really good press for your city. So I think the decision makers realized that pretty early on, and the innovation that was being brought to the table. And you know, the site was really interesting. I mentioned it was pre-entitled for a much bigger project. And so it actually made the entitlement a lot easier. Actually, the city wanted bigger buildings. It's very rare that the developer is saying, no, we only want 2 and 3, and the city saying, no, we want 5 to 7. But there was negotiation, and the parking was, you know, there were early conversations about, hey, a corner of the site, you know, that's now a future phase, could be a parking lot if this completely fails, you know, and nobody shows up. But I think the Culdesac team knew there was viability in this, but they're willing to sort of work with the city on that. And then it was an amendment to what's called a PAD in Tempe, planned area development, just like a PUD or similar process. But there was part of the entitlement process, which took about 12 months, which is pretty quick, I think, for Tempe. It was an extensive design package that was required to be submitted. I mean, we elevated every single building. Not a small amount of work and not a small expense for the developer, but we worked very closely, and the Culdesac team continues to work very closely with the Tempe staff on sort of getting this implemented.
One of the things I'll add too, that, you know, in terms of the role of public-private partnerships, is that, you know, Culdesac, when they were coming out of the gates, were both targeting Atlanta and Tempe moved faster. And so they started in Tempe, right? So by moving faster, that's engagement with political leadership, a little bit easier site from an entitlement standpoint. But again, if you want Culdesac to come to your town, it helps to, you know, get the parking requirements out of the way, have engaged leadership ready to help make these things happen.
Yeah, because I mean, it's inherent in the points, and all of what we presented is the projects break almost every development regulation in the city. So it's not like it's not just the parking. I mean, there's a lot of asks to make these projects possible, and it takes that partnership with the city, even if it's not a formal partnership, just to help get these projects through that process. And you know, the Tempe site was really interesting. I wasn't very sure about it at first, but it actually doesn't have very many adjacent neighbors to sort of push back on a project. So I think that was one of the reasons it was able to work its way through pretty quickly. It was the patchy corridor that it's along is pretty sort of disinvested corridor, like you see in a lot of cities, and a lot of sort of really low value single story buildings. It was vacant motel buildings, and was a place that just needed some investment.
Very cool. Let me see, I'll ask one more of my questions, then we'll open it up to the Q&A. So my last question for you both is, how does car-free urbanism impact the community? And what are the mobility conditions of each project? And how do they integrate with existing transit and bike systems, which you've touched on a little bit, but Justin, to do it again.
Yeah, I'll let Dan take this one first.
I'm going to say that impacts are something that's been made up by planners that I just really don't like. If we had to study the impacts of urbanism every time that something was built, we wouldn't have the great urban places that we have today. I think we need to flip that narrative. And how do these sorts of things benefit the community? And how are they good for the environment? You know, if you remove 600 cars from a project, like 600 fewer cars on the neighborhood streets, that's a really great thing. It's also great for the environment. So I think that it's really interesting that we sort of almost always in these conversations sort of flip toward impact. And the reality is we need to sort of think about, well, what the benefits are instead of thinking about impacts. I mean, you need to be thoughtful about ultimately there needing to be parking management in place around the cul-de-sac site. There currently isn't, but you don't want to let that sort of hold up a project or not make a project possible.
I mean, I think I want to piggyback what Dan's saying in that, and particularly, I think for both locations, but particularly for Southwest Atlanta, communities for years have been clamoring for, we want retail, we want stores, we want the benefits of living in a city that don't exist here right now. And it's like, well, you need rooftops, right? And so what Cul-de-sac's able to do is bring a lot of rooftops, but also be really intentional and thoughtful with the retail they're bringing, because, they talk about this hyper local retail where residents are going to spend a lot more of their dollars at the retail on site because it's right there and it's immediate. And it's, there's more resistance to going further off site than being present. I think and then the other thing is, we have only about 20,000 square feet of retail in total at the pilot, I can call it the pilot site at 1314, but the main farmers market site at 20 acres will have a lot more. And so you're really bringing a lot of amenity, a lot of co-working and incubator space to the community. So I think, it's positive impact, right? It's bringing jobs, opportunity, beer, tacos, ice cream to communities that want all of the above.
Wonderful. And yes, here at CNU, we are very interested in discussions about car-free urbanism. So I'm going to open this up to Q&A, and I have combined a couple of questions from the audience that are about affordable housing within the development. Basically, these questions are, what is the ratio? And then also, are costs offset at all by the fact that there is not parking on site?
I'll jump because I think I know we have more affordability in our projects than Tempe. Atlanta, we have inclusionary zoning in our Beltline corridor, and we were in it for the 1314 site. We, just for math, you have to do either 15% of your units at 80% of AMI. That translates like $1,500 for a 1-bed. I think like $1,700 for a 2-bed, and that's 2022 numbers. You could also do 10% at 60% of AMI, but the 15% at 80. Sorry for throwing the math around. That's the math that people tend to do. But what we've been doing with Culdesac and other development projects is pushing our developer clients to say, you're not going to get through zoning with just the minimums. You're going to have to offer more. And the more that we've typically been pushing clients to offer is at least do an extra 5% at the 60% of AMI. That's a big deal. But when you're providing extra, you can modify the requirements to say those could only be studios, right? That would be enough to meet it. Culdesac wanted to go studio heavy for some of the 5 and 6 story buildings anyways. And when you're going car light, you can make the math work, right? Right now it's $1,000 a month for a studio. And if you're at about 340 square feet, like we're at Culdesac, we're at $3 a foot, right? From a rental standpoint. So that's not crazy, but so we're also having clients unbundle parking and not fully park out the studios and other deals as well to achieve the affordability, which is a political necessity in Atlanta. You're not going to get it. You're not going to get your zoning approvals unless you're bringing something to the table in that realm. And there's currently a range of negotiations on affordability levels, both for commercial and residential, still happening with Atlanta Beltline that as they're negotiating, try to get that project moving forward. And then there'll be another round of negotiations with the community after that for sure.
Yeah, I think in Tempe, if they're all market rate. And I think part of this is you imagine the level of risk that a developer is taking for to develop the country's first car-free project. And so really needing to prove the concept, prove the viability, and then in future projects, be thinking about, percentage affordability, be thinking about green building, be thinking about all these other things that are ideal and all of us would love to include in the projects, but just proof of concept was really important, right? As a first, and like there was so much risk inherent in even just the car-free aspect that they just wanted to focus on let's get one built, let's see how the market responds, and then we can do all these other things we want to be doing on the future projects once we prove the concept.
Thanks so much, Dan. That also answers a couple of questions in the Q&A that are interested in the role of nature and climate adaptation for these projects. Was there anything else that we want to add there otherwise?
I mean, I think, Dan's responses to the desert climate are really great. Atlanta's much more about having active, also having active outdoor spaces, but we're hotter and wetter. So, good porches, good cover, but good, kind of semi-private space as a buffer and filter, particularly at the ground level, were some of the things we looked at as we're working through our layouts and designs. But I think, again, adapt to climate, know where you're at, give people good outdoor spaces that are, usable and wonderful.
Yeah, we had a really talented landscape architect on our team, sort of give a shout out to her. Chris Floor is her name, Floor and Associates. And obviously the selection of the plantings was very thoughtful in terms of the desert climate as well. But the other interesting thing is outside of the core mixed use area, which is just that corner by the transit station, the entire project is decomposed granite. So it's sort of, you're not sort of constantly on a paved surface that will also be reflecting heat. And then the design of the paseos, the design of the courtyards, the smaller secondary public spaces, and how the landscape integrates into those very thoughtfully it's sort of just a level of thoughtfulness and desert responsiveness that is inherent in the design that won't really be like that's coming. The trees were starting to be planted a couple weeks ago. I almost showed a video of a little bobcat tractor with a tree in the shovel trying to get through one of the little paseos, like to get to the spot where the tree needed to be planted. And
they're cursing you the whole time, right? Like, damn it, Dan.
Yeah, he's screaming, did you plan this project? But yeah, it's we were thoughtful. It's and then there is one park space right in the middle, like a larger I'll say green. It won't be like a lawn, but it'll be more heavily landscaped, and it's where the dog park will be, and a little bit more heavily landscaped than the other spots. But it's just really thoughtful location and types of plantings to make it very livable.
Yes, it's very interesting that these two projects are in such different climates, but are approaching some of the same issues in creative ways. The next kind of group of questions that we have from the connection. This is both connection to the downtown and connection within the Culdesac region itself. So basically the two questions are how connected to major employment centers are each of these projects in a car-free way, and how connected are they for people with limited mobility to move around the Culdesac site?
Dan, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, well, two transit stops to the west is downtown Tempe, which has the university and a major employment center. What's happening probably 3 or 4 transit stops to the east, downtown Mesa, we did a form-based code there about 7 years ago, and it's now exploding, has about $500 million of private sector investment in it. So that's another major sort of employment center that's starting to happen. But I think there's also this notion that a lot of people are going to be working remotely. There's a large co-working space in the sort of community center, mixed use center as well. And there are what we call bookable spaces, and each of the courtyards has several bookable spaces where if you want to have a meeting with somebody or do a live, social media stream, you can book one of these spaces for a day, to work with that. So there's a lot of different ways that the design has sort of thought about different types of employment sort of conditions.
Yeah, and I think, co-working is coming into, both the smaller project at 1314 for us, and then definitely a range of co-working at the larger project. Connection wise, access to jobs, we do have MARTA heavy rail station, a half a block away from the 1314 site. But in addition to that, the our belt line is getting built out, and probably in the next 18 months, we will have the whole eastern half of the belt line paved and finished. At that point, with an e-bike, you're 30 minutes to Ponce City Market. And I say that because that is the epicenter of tech jobs. Now, that's maybe not like the most equitable, broad-based job center, but that is a powerhouse of tech on the east side of town. And a 30-minute bike ride, you will get there significantly faster in rush hour traffic than in a car. And so the Beltline is transforming, and e-bikes are absolutely transforming where you can go, how you can go, and how fast it's going to take in Atlanta. And it will be greatly significant than having to be stuck in a vehicle. So, the MARTA, the train will get you downtown. There's bus access as well. But I was joking with Duke, who's one of the great folks at Culdesac working on this. He's living over on the east side of town, close to where I am, and he was having to go down to the site. And I asked him, "Do you take MARTA or do you e-bike?" And he's like, "It's faster to e-bike right now. It's a 30-minute e-bike from like northeast central Atlanta down to southwest Atlanta on gravel trails than it is to take a car, right, or to take the train, right?" So, like, that's what we're looking at as we rethink city mobility.
Very cool. And then this is one kind of to hopefully encapsulate a number of the questions that are left in our Q&A, which is, what guidance do you have for others who are looking to create car-free developments, especially now that this kind of has a proof of concept?
Dan, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's great about this is the first phase residents are going to move in here shortly, but I think once the first couple of phases are occupied and stabilized, I think that it proves the concept. I know there's last time I knew it was like 4,000 or 5,000 people on an interested list for so I don't think there's going to be a shortage of demand, but I think that I think what's great about Culdesac is they're really committed to their, this idea of the car-free community, and they're adapting it obviously as they go, and will need to continue to adapt it. But I mentioned it earlier, they're a couple of the smartest people Jeff and Ryan are a couple of the smartest people I know, and their team sort of are all super, super smart people too. So I think that just kind of sticking to that vision, and sort of not just being willing to sort of find ways to push for and build support for the concept, and to not compromise the point where it's compromising that vision. Because I think, similar to the way that New Urbanism was responding to the demand for walkable living, I think this is responding to the demand now for car-free living. And one of the things we talked about a little bit in the preparation sort of discussion was, like, should more New Urbanists be promoting car-free urbanism? Because I think maybe this is the future. I think there's a clear demand for it, and I think you could do this in a lot of different markets, and it would be very viable.
I think one of the interesting conversations I had with Ryan and Jeff were related to scale, and I think it's context of place. And I think what's helpful is both when we look at Tempe and Atlanta, both of these contexts were amenity light, right? In terms of what did the neighborhoods have in existing conditions for people to benefit from. So I think they rightly have a minimum viable scale to come in and to create the there to have enough support, amenity to support a car light or car-free lifestyle. And, the conversation we had is that, like, just a 200 unit multifamily deal, you're not creating enough there of support for this kind of transition. I self-developed a little 16 unit cottage community without any parking. And we were comparing the notes. And it's like, when you're at 12, 20 units, you can fit into an existing neighborhood and people can park on street or choose not to have cars. Like, you can work with the existing systems in that scale. And if you're at like 15 to 20 acres, you can create your own ecosystem. Like, if you don't have a vibrant community with all these amenities pre-existing, it's hard to do a mid-sized project that's going to be viable. So if you want to do mid-size, you need to be very amenity rich. And so in Atlanta, that's like Midtown Atlanta. So that's more of a challenge to developers in Midtown Atlanta, where you have the amenity, you have all the stuff at your doorstep. You need to be thinking there particularly about car lights, right? So again, context is really important to figure out where and how to try these things along with scale.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because Eric, I think you worked on this at Summerhill in Atlanta that I saw when I was up there. That sort of one of the early focuses was that Main Street and making the Main Street a destination and attractive amenity. And I know a developer in Omaha, Nebraska, who basically he had bought up a bunch of apartments around, like missing middle aggregated apartments, but then he bought up most of the Main Street buildings and just invested in that because he knew it would create the type of place that his residents would want to live in.
Yeah, and that one, just as a quick comment, it was a really easy conversation. The developers were partnering with Georgia State. This was the first phase of a many-phase, massive, probably $1 billion investment over there by the former Braves stadium after the Braves left town. And they knew they needed to get it right. They needed to get that downtown vibe, get the place happening to set the tone for all future development. But the other thing that was great is that we had all these vacant parking lots behind our main street. So we never talked about parking, right? There's like transitional parking, plenty to get the vibe right and to get it going. And we actively plan to get rid of a lot of those parking lots. And, Hedgewood, a local great nervous developer, came in with Lou Oliver, designed some amazing stuff to chew up the parking incrementally. And the place it's amazing. The Main Street that we help with is kicking ass, taking names, but all the housing Lou and Hedgewood did is amazing. They've got other stuff coming in. But again, if we had to have worried about parking, and we had some, not a ton, but parking for the retail, we would have never got off the ground. And it was a helpful strategy of incrementing, kind of slowly weaning everybody off the parking as the place continued to build out. So there was enough support when it was just getting started for the businesses, but they're getting less and less parking now and more people coming.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for your insights. And it looks like with that, we are just a little past 1 o'clock. So we can go ahead and wrap this up. A recording of this webinar will be available on our website within 24 hours. So thank you very much, Dan and Eric, for taking the time to talk with us today.
So thank you for having us.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks for having me.
All right. Have a wonderful day, everyone.